Hello everyone, this is Anand and welcome to the day 2 of webinar series on marine mammal conservation in India. I would like to welcome Dr. Mridula Srinivasan, who is with us right now from USA, and she would be talking about building a comprehensive marine mammal program in India. This is Anand and welcome to the day 2 of webinar series. I'm sorry for that. Dr. Mridula Srinivasan has a doctoral degree in wildlife and fisheries sciences from Texas A&M University. Investigating predation risk effects from killer whales on the behavioral ecology of dusky dolphins in New Zealand using an individual-based model. Previously, she has earned degrees in environmental management from Florida Tech, masters from Florida Tech, and bachelor's in zoology and molecular biology from University of Delhi, India. Mridula is broadly interested in behavioral ecology, predator-prey interactions, predation risk effects, and understanding the effects of climate variability on the foraging ecology of and distribution of seabirds and marine mammals. She is actively involved in international training and capacity building in marine mammal education, research, and standing response, especially in India. She also has been associated with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fisheries Department for about 9 years and is currently Director, Protected Resources and Biodiversity Division and Marine Mammal Turtle Division and Marine Mammal and Turtle Division at the NMFS Southeast Fisheries Science Center in Miami, Florida. Here she manages a multidisciplinary research program focused on ecosystem and habitat studies in Florida, coral reef monitoring and restoration, marine mammal and sea turtle population assessments and conservation, and reef fish ecology. She serves as the Society for Marine Mammalogy Education Chair and is passionate about ocean literacy and mentoring the next generation of marine scientists, especially underrepresented groups. Welcome, Mridula. I invite you to begin your presentation. You have 1 hour ahead of you, and then we'll take question and answers. This program is also being broadcasted live on YouTube, so there will be questions coming from our YouTube watchers as well. Welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm really delighted to be talking to you during this multi-day seminar. So let me share my screen. Is it visible?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much again, Anand and Dr. Shivakumar and the Wildlife Institute of India for organizing this webinar series and for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. So today I offered essentially to talk about building a marine mammal program in India, given the focus on Project Dolphin. And what I wanted to do today was to speak about the importance of building a program, why that's important, and what are some of the core elements of such a program. And then I wanted to switch gears to talk about what are the drivers for NOAA Fisheries international involvement, particularly supporting research and collaboration. And then I'll talk about the Marine Mammal Conservation Program in the US, particularly as NOAA runs it. And then I'll offer some of the lessons learned based on what we have accomplished in NOAA and elsewhere. I thought I'll share some lessons learned, which hopefully will be useful. So the first question is, why do we even want to build a research program for marine mammals? And ultimately, the goal is that we are able to protect and conserve marine mammals and their habitats within India's EEZ. And we know that there is a wonderful diversity of species in Indian waters, and we know next to nothing about many of these species. We have some understanding, and we are making a lot of progress in understanding some of the coastal populations, but the offshore populations remain an unknown entity. So there's much to be learned, and there's much to be accomplished. I would say we're just sort of starting off when it comes to marine mammal science, establishing it nationwide. Now, with any program, I think it's just absolutely crucial that the scientific underlying science remains strong, and we have confidence in the data that we produce. And I think the scientific method, without a doubt, is the best path to follow. And over time, I think, having worked in NOAA, I realized that it's not easy. Even if you have the data, sometimes decision making becomes very hard, but it is the cornerstone of all that we do and the cornerstone of conservation. So even if the data is slightly uncertain, it is still possible to make policy decisions, but it is absolutely critical that we invest in the science to build any program, and that has to be the most important factor. Now, before building a program, I think one of the things I always thought about is there are a whole bunch of questions to be answered. And having worked in building programs, and also right now that I'm involved in is trying to establish a turtle program, a marine mammal and turtle program, I've realized over the years that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. The first question is whether legislative frameworks that exist, are they sufficient? For example, in India, we have the Wildlife Protection Act. Is that sufficient? Is that providing enough guidance for somebody to conduct marine mammal research or to conserve marine mammal species within India? What is needed to study, manage, and recover marine mammals? Do we have to study all species in all areas, or do we study key species in some areas? Who conducts the study? What type of studies do we conduct? And how should that data that is collected be delivered so that managers and scientists can use it? And finally, how can that program be sustained? So in my mind, these are some of the questions that need answering. The other aspect is the people. Over the years, I have again understood that it's not just about having marine mammal biologists or wildlife biologists. We need a plethora of scientists of different calibers, of different backgrounds, to actually help build programs, to sustain them, and to make advancements. And these includes endocrinologists, population biologists, computer scientists, engineers, birders. I believe that seabird biologists are some of the best marine mammal observers we have. And so there is a huge scope or huge impetus needed to focus on multidisciplinary or cross-functional teams when building programs. And then, of course, there is the Stranding response networks and focusing on first responders. This is absolutely critical for any nascent country trying to establish a marine mammal research program. Stranding response remains the easiest way to collect information. It also serves as an early warning system of any anomalies happening in the environment. And I think from an investment perspective, this is one of those low-hanging fruits that when invested, done properly, and when there's enough support and infrastructure, it can really yield valuable results. From a research perspective, I think increasingly we do rely on statisticians. Data is scarce. Sometimes you get a lot of data, sometimes you have very little data. And it's absolutely critical to have the expertise of statisticians, especially survey design specialists, who can really help you from the get-go in how data is collected, how it will be analyzed, and how it will be used. And then, of course, graduate, undergraduate students, we cannot survive, or any program cannot survive without the constant pipeline of students who bring in fresh ideas, who have the talent, and who will be able to build upon whatever programs or initiatives are started. And of course, technicians. There is huge, when you go out to sea, particularly on larger surveys, there is a need for very specialized technicians to collect either ecosystem data, oceanographic data, or marine mammal data. And so there is a need for that investment. Finally, I think in India and most countries outside the Western world, there is a real focus on community engagement, community understanding of cultures, value systems. And so it's absolutely critical to include people increasingly, whether they're economics majors, anthropologists, sociologists, marine policy experts, and environmental lawyers. they can really help in translating some of the science into management speak or something that is relevant to the communities we work in. And finally, because we live in the age of social media, and this presentation is also being broadcast on YouTube, there is no doubt that media and public communications are absolutely critical as we go forward to make sure that we communicate the science, people understand why we care about marine mammals, why they are important to conserve, and how this fits in with the other national priorities that are equally important. Of course, with building any program is expensive, and marine mammal programs in particular are incredibly expensive. We need both the small and large ocean observation platforms, whether it's RIBS or it's one of those large ships, which can allow you to go farther offshore and stay at sea for longer periods of time. And both these systems, depending on the capabilities, will have different navigation and environmental sensors, which are absolutely critical. And then, of course, there are these ocean observation networks that increasingly are deployed in different parts of the world, in different waters. And they can be fitted with sensors, whether it's acoustic sensors or biological sampling sensors. And these have become incredibly important. Field equipment, without a doubt, is a need. And whether it's cameras, whether it's salinity measurements or DO, so all kinds of different equipments are available these days, and they are expensive. And so there requires a lot of investment and long-term investment in making that happen. Of course, ultimately funding. Marine mammals, unfortunately, do not come to land and make it easier for us. They are at sea, and the best data that we can collect, or the best way we can understand marine mammals, is at sea by collecting information there. And so funding is absolutely critical. 1-year funding, 2-year funding, while be useful for small projects, are sometimes very insufficient when you're trying to establish a long-term program where you're really trying to understand the life history and the population status of multiple marine mammal species. So there's a minimum of 3 to 5 years of funding that's very critical. Now, there are different models when it comes to establishing programs. And one model that in the US and some other countries have also worked is the idea of government investing in sort of the bigger, broad scale projects, whereas the smaller university groups or NGOs or independent researchers focus on more of the fine scale surveys. And both are equally important. Government has the resources, the capabilities to invest in sort of these broad scale projects, while the fine scale surveys conducted by NGOs or other researchers, they really get into that question or hypothesis driven test studies, and that's incredibly important. But in both groups, and particularly the government, the R&D is so critical. Research and development, without that investment, it's impossible to make any scientific strides, in scientific development. Similarly, engagement with the community, education outreach, these are some things that are important to occur at different levels, whether it's the government level or whether it's run at a local level, national or local. And also there is this partnership aspect, which is absolutely critical. Nobody can do it all. And therefore you need these government university partnerships, whether it's sort of cooperative agreements or agreements between government and universities or NGOs or researchers. There has to be a bidirectional flow of information, but also expertise and staff. Government can recruit and retain talent from universities and from NGOs or other groups. And similarly, the nexus between the universities and the government is equally vital, because that really helps in addressing some of the critical questions, both short-term and long-term. And we'll talk more about that in subsequent slides. Now, in my mind, and really this whole presentation is sort of my perspective, is there are really two types of scientific endeavors. And one is the curiosity-driven science, which I think is absolutely critical when you're starting out on any program, is about the discovery, the joy of science. And that really spurs innovation. It allows students who are just getting into a marine science field to be motivated to find solutions. And I think it's very important to emphasize that just because NOAA or the US or other nations may have developed or have established marine mammal programs doesn't mean they have the answers. There is so much we don't know, and so much that is local to India that we still don't know. So it's important to have those indigenous solutions, whether it's developing tags that work here or acoustic recorders. And so rather than manufacturing it elsewhere, it's very important to engage on the IT and engineering expertise and the knowledge and that is available to spur innovation. And I think that's really something that's absolutely critical for any scientific program or research program. And then, of course, it goes without saying that all that we're doing, like I said in the beginning, the ultimate outcome is for protecting and conserving marine mammals and their habitats. And so research for management is what gets us to that point. And so we have all these acute issues, whether it's ocean noise, whether it's bycatch issues, whether it's algal toxins or other type of pollutions. Ultimately there is a need for short-term information for managers and regulators. And so it's very critical that we do produce the science that's relevant for community engagements, or whether it's for development activities or for the defense sector or the energy sector. So there are these two types of science, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think curiosity-driven science can really support management. I think it's more long-term thinking, whereas management is more short-term thinking. At least that's how I view it. When we think about in terms of data, and I'm just taking a very small subset of what I consider as data essentials, and this is a very high level look at it. It's when we think about data for a program that's just starting up or as we're building or strengthening it, is the baseline information. And in India, as we're just sort of scratching the surface and learning more and more, we are getting really good data, but there's still so much more we don't know. And so that goes to trying to understand occurrence patterns, distribution patterns, movement ecology, population structure, behavioral ecology. And so there are a lot of different aspects of marine mammal science that we need, those core elements that help build a program. And then once those basic life history, biology, ecology information is collected, we can then be better prepared to answer the impacts from anthropogenic activities. And these days, because of the capabilities we have with big data and the kind of technology advancements we've made, there are really good analytical frameworks and decision-making tools that we can develop to assess these impacts, whether it's from noise, whether it's from fisheries interactions, or that it's because of ecosystem changes. And then one other thing that's lately becoming very, very important in a lot of countries is building risk assessment frameworks. It's building this predictive capacity for managers to understand where the risk is more, where because of climate change or ecosystem changes, animal distributions will shift and therefore put them at risk for bycatch or entanglements or vessel strikes. And so the more we invest in understanding what is the risk, then appropriate mitigation measures could potentially be developed. And then, of course, there is the whole idea of the human dimensions. We continue to need our traditional knowledge, and we need our stakeholder perspectives and participation at all levels. And that goes without saying, and it's absolutely fundamental for the success of any research program. And then lastly, and I think this is one of the things that sometimes gets ignored, is data storage and access. All this data is wasted exercise if it's not properly stored and is accessible to the public or to people who really need this information. So the format is very important, accessibility is important, and also the data access rights, establishing those agreements is very critical. So why is NOAA involved in a lot of international work? And I just wanted to give some idea of current drivers and also past drivers. From an international perspective, NOAA's biggest goals are to advance US interest at international fisheries management and science organizations, develop international science and research partnerships, and then provide technical assistance to other countries to help with the stewardship of living marine resources. So that's some of the biggest drivers from international activities. But lately in 2016, there was a NOAA import rule, seafood import rule that was established. And these have really impacted several foreign fisheries, including India. And I'll speak to it in the next slide. But because of these provisions, there is an incentive or increased emphasis on trying to collect data on abundance and distribution and mortality that match NOAA standards or international standards. And part of that is because there is a list of foreign fisheries that is produced, and this is the 2021, and I've just included the India information from India that is published. And as you can see, and you can also Google this and get more information, there's a lot that is unknown. And so part of the investment now that's happening in the Indian government is trying to get the information on abundance and distribution for multiple marine mammal species so that they can meet the requirements of this NOAA seafood import rule. Currently, there is an exemption, but there is a need to collect that information fairly soon. Now, the other new focus or driver for international engagement at a very broad level, not just between India and US or between some countries, is this global initiative that the United Nations is promoting, which is the Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And they are currently releasing a plan, the 2021-2030 plan, which really focuses on improving the knowledge that we have and building capacity and really promoting relationships and partnerships across different countries, data poor, data rich countries, but just allowing more scientific exchange and bi-directional information flow. And so this is something that really gives us a mechanism for different countries, particularly NOAA and India, the US and India, to interact. And I recommend Googling this or searching for this, and I'm happy to provide more information. So switching gears now, I want to talk more about the managing, how in the United States we manage marine mammal populations. The fundamental legislative mandate that spurs all kinds of marine mammal research and conservation is the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972, which was amended in 1994. And this affords protection to all marine mammals. And within the MMP and within the US, we tend to protect or study animals at a lower conservation unit, not at the species or subspecies level. Sometimes it does occur, but usually we define it at the stock level. And there is a biological definition or a definition we use where these units are essentially genetically isolated and interbreed when mature. And so it is these stocks that form the basis for our marine mammal stock assessments. And I'll talk more about that in detail in the next few slides. In the amendment of the 1994, there was the establishment of the PBR framework. The PBR is nothing but the potential biological removal framework. Now, why did these amendments occur in 1994? The reason is the 1972 Act was just too ambitious and aspirational. It was just impossible to study all marine mammal species or subspecies within the US or protect them equally. And because of this uncertainty, there were some amendments, but also it was realized that we need a management framework. And I'll get into the definition of PBR shortly. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act, essentially, the goal is to prevent the interaction or taking or importing of marine mammals and marine mammal products. It is illegal to harass, feed, hunt, capture, kill, or attempt to do so. And there are some exemptions. But within the MMPA, there are some specific goals that we are required to follow. One is to maintain these stocks or conservation units at the optimum sustainable population level, and which is essentially which essentially implies maintaining at or above 50% of carrying capacity. And the other more important goal of MMPA is to reduce incidental mortality and serious injury to zero. And this is, again, a very aspirational goal, but it is an explicit goal of the MMPA. This is really important and I think very critical, is that the law, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, protects marine mammals no matter where they are, whether it's domestic or international. And the marine mammal species, and this is very unique in the sense that it gives this complete protection to all marine mammal species, regardless of their conservation or population status. But there's also the Endangered Species Act, which affords even more protection to particularly at-risk species or species that are likely to be extinct in the foreseeable future. And like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, there are limitations on how we interact with endangered species. And so things like harassing, harming, pursuing, hunting, wounding, killing, which is defined as a take, is prohibited. And there are approximately 165 endangered and threatened species within the NOAA fisheries jurisdiction, 66 of which are foreign. Now, with marine mammals, why it's important to have this sort of legislative framework and the scientific basis is because of the animals themselves. We know marine mammals are have very low population growth rates. They are like other mammals. They have high adult survivorship. Again, it depends on the species, depends on the habitat. They do sexually mature late. They have often only one offspring. And again, it differs by species, by area. And most importantly, particularly for the whales, we know they take an inordinate amount of time to recover. And since the whaling ended, some of the whale species have bounced back, but it does take a long period of time after a significant impact or incident for these animals to get back to their optimum population. And one of the most unique and important things about marine mammals is the behavioral plasticity that we see between dolphins and whales and porpoises. Of course, dugongs and manatees have their own sort of characteristics. But with dolphins, we know that they have very complex structures, social structures, and there is a great investment in parental care. All of these factors, the life history factors, as well as the behavioral aspects, make it really complex to study these animals. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act is in a way very unique in the sense that it is one of the few legislative acts that mandates that I know of, and at least to my knowledge, that has such a heavy focus on the science. And so part of achieving those goals that were stated in the Marine Mammal Protection Act is to make sure that the science is there to support conservation. So it's science-based conservation. And to implement the law, NOAA in particular has invested in developing guidelines for assessing marine mammals. So while the MMPA gives overarching goals and objectives, we still need to know how do we achieve those goals. And so we have, within NOAA, developed, in the United States, developed these different guidelines that allow us to implement the law. One is, of course, the guidelines for assessing marine mammal stocks. Then I spoke to you about the potential biological removal or PBR management framework. And then, of course, acoustic thresholds of injury. So there are criteria that are now established that allow us to determine what the likely impact would be on a species from different noise sources in terms of a temporary threshold shift or a permanent threshold shift, which is a permanent acoustic injury. But this is just one aspect of it. Ultimately, we still need to do these comprehensive assessments to really understand what's going on the science side. On the management side, there are a whole slew of activities that are undertaken to ensure that marine mammals are conserved as functioning elements of the ecosystem, and they are above the PBR threshold. And so there's a whole different aspects of permitting, regulations, reviewing the status, listing, delisting species, and then recovering those species. To a large extent, though, I would say that we are still counting animals, and I'll tell you why. So the stock assessment is really about estimating abundance and distribution, and it is designed to achieve the goals of the MMPA with the type and quality of data we can get, but not we wish we could get. So it allows us to limit our focus or prioritize. The Marine Mammal Protection Act also requires us to compare whatever human cost mortality we have to the potential biological removal. And I know I've mentioned this a few times, but I'll get into details about it in just in the next couple of slides. And lastly, to reduce variation, because there is so much uncertainty with respect to mortality and serious injury data, we tend to collate or compile data with respect to the average annual mortality and serious injury over a 5-year period. Now, despite all the investment and despite a lengthy history of marine mammal science, we are not doing that great. We have about 430 protected species stocks that NOAA Fisheries manages, and out of which 332 are marine mammal stocks, but only 20% of them are really adequately assessed in terms of knowing all aspects of their life history and threats. So it is a big, big undertaking. Now, each of these stock assessment reports have these different components that help us essentially get a profile of the species, knowing what do we know about them, what's the population status, what's the mortality levels, and what are some of the habitat changes or and population metrics that are critical. And I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but this is just as FYI or information that these are the guidelines that we published that is the Bible or is the handbook for how the stock assessment reports are produced and published on an annual basis or every 3 years, depending on the type of marine mammal stocks. Now, potential biological removal is what I mentioned several times, and this is the management framework that the United States follows, and some other countries follow different variations of this. Essentially, this is this sort of safe limit or removal limit that is the number of animals that can be removed through human cost mortality without compromising the viability of the population. And it is a formula, it is an equation that is used to determine the PBR or the removal limit, which is essentially a product of the population estimate, the growth rate of the species, and a recovery factor, which is the probability of the animal recovering from the state it's in. And I'm not going to go into details here, but suffices to say, much of what PBR, the biggest determinant of the PBR value is the population estimate. The other two factors, B and C, these variables, more often than not, we use default values, primarily because we don't have enough data. And when we do have data, we can plug in actual values, but a lot of times we do use default values to estimate. So much of our focus is therefore to make sure we get an accurate and precise abundance estimate, because that's what determines the removal threshold, and that's what is critical for our managers. Now, moving on to the stranding response. So the aspect I've spoken so far is about the research aspect of understanding at-sea information or at-sea marine mammal data collection. And then you have the other aspect, which is the information we collect on the beaches. And within the Marine Mammal Protection Act, Title IV allowed NOAA to establish the Marine Mammal Health and Stranding Program. And so there are 4 areas that are important. One is the stranding program, entanglement networks, unusual mortality and event response, biosurveillance, and baseline health research, and then ultimately a grant assistance program that funds or provides funding for multiple entities that are involved in stranding response to get funding from NOAA to carry out those response activities, to collect data, which ultimately is provided back to data, particularly summary data or level A information. Now, stranding causes why marine mammal strand is always complicated. We know over the years that it can be multiple factors, whether it's intrinsic, natural causes such as disease, illness, predation, or because of break in social cohesion or disorientation. But there's also other reasons, whether it's sonar or because of entanglement. But often it's really hard to determine the cause of death or stranding. And with live strandings, it's equally complicated. And with every stranding event, we learn quite a bit of how we have to respond and what data we have to collect. But a lot of times we are also left helpless. But thankfully, there are enough training resources and organizations that have this information on what data to collect, whether it's a live stranded animal or dead stranded animal, that I think we're making significant strides. And in India alone, I know there's a lot to still happen. And, I've been working to support the establishing a national guidance along with so many others. We think that's very important. But at the local level and the regional level, there are so many wonderful groups that are trying to get the information and to respond to these strandings. So how does this fit in? And this figure does a really good job of putting it all together from the perspective of the marine mammal data collection through and producing stock assessment reports, and then the stranding network. And these two programs work really hand in hand in establishing the marine mammal program that is supported or established at NOAA. But there's more to the story. So while we are trying to understand the population, counting animals, understanding abundance, density, distribution, and also recording data from stranding animals, we still have this whole bunch of questions that we have to ask. And that spans the entire gamut of science, essentially, of animal ecology, animal biology, from physiology to community ecology to understanding, how trophic cascades happen or cumulative stressors work, and of course, genetics. And these days, of course, omics is such a big part of trying to use the resources or the infrastructure we have to process multiple samples to understand the population structures of multiple species. And so how do we collect this data? There are different ways. And ultimately, I think, going back to that previous slide, which has a whole bunch of questions, and this is just a real small subset of questions that can be asked, that really defines or determines the kind of data we collect. Now, for very large areas, one expensive option is aircraft, and a lot of countries too uses. US uses it, and some other countries use it, especially if you have to cover a huge sea state. Then it's really useful to help in determining occurrence patterns, distribution, and also abundance, provided we use certain correction factors to account for the animals not being detected or the observer missing the animal. For coastal surveys, there are always the option of small boats that allow you to do day trips and collect more of this fine scale information, more question-driven science, whether it's about social structure, it's about behavior, in terms of foraging behavior, or it's about interactions with fishing vessels, for example, or other boats. From a broad scale perspective, at NOAA and in some other countries as well, it's absolutely critical to have these big ships to allow you to cover large areas. And one method is sort of the vessel line transect survey, which is just essentially collecting visual marine mammal data. But oftentimes and increasingly, the visual data collection is complemented or is done in combination with acoustic data collection, ecosystem data collection, as well as sometimes prey information. But as you can see, when you do these broad scale surveys, you can get information from multiple species. When you do small boat surveys, you can follow the animals, you can get more in-depth data. But these broad scale surveys allow you to get to that important question of abundance and density and habitat use for a larger number of species. Of course, there are now different things you can collect when you are doing these surveys. There's eDNA now, which is an exciting discipline of genomics that is really improving and expanding our knowledge and allowing us to do more non-invasive work. But we continue to do biopsy tagging to get those genetic samples, understanding movement patterns through satellite tagging. But also there's the oceanographic component, whether it's CTD or XPT sampling. So there are different ways that you can sample the ocean as well as the animals. With respect to abundance, and this is sort of the bread and butter when it comes to abundance estimation, and that's line transect distance sampling. And this has been the MO or modus operandi of trying to collect information on group size, species ID, behavior at a very instantaneous level. And the framework provided by Buckland et al. And improved upon by others has really set the basis for how data is collected. But increasingly now, with Bayesian techniques coming in and the advancements we've done in habitat modeling, we can take the data that we collect from these broad scale surveys or even smaller surveys and plug them into these larger analytical frameworks that allow us to get more precise information and get more out of the data that we have. Because data, no matter how hard we try, the data is still going to be imperfect. And there will be uncertainty, and we need these statistical models or frameworks to help us make sense and interpret the data for our purposes. When it comes to, so that's all on the that I've spoken so far is on the abundance side of things or density estimation side of things. But then the other side of the equation is how many animals are lost because of natural reasons or human caused mortality. Measuring human cost mortality or serious injury is very complicated, as some of you may know. There are different ways we can determine mortality or bycatch, and that's we have to have these different sources of information. We need to know fishing effort. Increasingly, there is a focus on electronic monitoring, which, while very exciting and is still in the nascent stages, there is still a whole level of discussion going on in terms of the proprietary, who owns the data, how is the data going to be accessed, and how can it be used without violating privacy laws. So it's much more complicated. However, in terms of the technology, the machine learning tools that have been developed allow us to ID animals much better than we would in the past, whether it's seabirds or marine mammals. But it's still not perfect. There's still a room for improvement. And then, of course, there is fishery observers in many places. You have humans collecting information on catch data or bycatch, and whether it's the targeted fish or non-targeted fish, as well as protected species. And then there's, of course, the landings data that logbooks and things like that that can help you understand. The stranding data, which I didn't mention here, is also another aspect of it. And that's why it's just not about fisheries related mortality. It's about including all aspects of mortality that marine mammals experience in the sort of settings they are in. We live in increasingly busy environments. The marine environment is really becoming busy in terms of the shipping traffic, the cargo traffic, the kind of development activities that are going on, defense activities, as well as research activities. So there's a lot of things that are happening. And so the potential for mortality is very high for marine mammals. So I'm going to end now with some concluding thoughts and in terms of lessons learned. So just to sort of summarize, I talked about why it's important to build a program and how important it is to conserve and protect marine mammals, and why the building blocks of having a research program that's successful and sustainable is not easy. And you have these investments in people and resources that's very critical to achieve those goals, the research goals, or the ultimate goal of protecting marine mammals. And then I spoke to you about some of the drivers that are important for NOAA to be involved in international activities. And then some of the management and the research and management enterprise that NOAA's marine mammal program consists of. And these are things that have happened over several decades. So what I've summarized to you is essentially decades worth of work. But by working on these things at NOAA and elsewhere, one thing I've learned is that the NOAA model or some other model may not be perfect. And each country has to find the model, the research model, the management model that works for the interests or the problems that a particular country faces. So that is something very critical. And so the other lessons learned that I wanted to share with is it's really incredibly important to have that baseline information or the foundational data to build a time series. The longer the data series you have, the more capable we are as scientists and managers to detect changes, to give information that allows us to engage in ecosystem-based management, to address both the developmental goals, but also the conservation goals. And at NOAA, because of those early investments, there's a lot of baseline data and information in some regions, but in some regions, there's absolutely no baseline data. And that continues to be a critical gap throughout the world for marine mammals. The other thing is it's so important to prioritize which species are going to be studied and what habitats are going to be studied and protected, because nobody has the capabilities or the resources, infinite resources to do everything. So it's very crucial for the decision-making bodies to help prioritize what species are indicator species or keystone species, and what species that you can invest in, which will result in measurable outcomes. Support curiosity-driven science. Given that marine mammal science is still at its infancy, it's really important that our students and researchers ask those important questions that lead us to better understand marine mammals, their life history, the ecology. We just don't know anything. We're still scratching the surface when it comes to marine mammals. We need to support both fine scale and broad scale, that is question-driven as well as management-driven surveys and research activities. And I think this is something that a lot of people who've been working in India and elsewhere, and this is just a universal problem, is just overcoming bureaucratic bottlenecks and jurisdictions. And this is something that's universal, but it's absolutely critical to build efficient and effective bureaucratic networks that allow research to occur, for programs to be developed, to be set up, to be nurtured. And then you also need some coordinating body that establishes some guidelines so that not everybody's not operating independently and has some common framework or mission vision that allows people to work towards an important goal. Data sharing is equally important. Everybody's data is important to them, but the more data is shared and communicated and disseminated, it's absolutely vital. And with that data sharing comes the importance of leveraging partnership, government, universities, independent researchers, entities. We really need to work together, whether it's national, international, local, regional partnerships, and then publish. I think without it's absolutely critical, and part of the scientific process is to disseminate the data to internationally peer-reviewed journals. And the more the data is out there, the easier it is for people coming after us to build on that information. And lastly, I think this is something very important that is important to me personally, but I think important to a lot of people in this working group, but also in India, is investing in student careers in marine mammal science. We need to target students early and nurture that spark, that interest and curiosity for marine mammals. And that has to happen very early at the junior school or high school level, and then improved or refined at the undergraduate level. So I think this is sort of the lessons learned from my perspective that I wanted to share with you. And hopefully this is useful to people listening to this webinar, but also others interested in marine mammal science and building a program. With that, thank you very much. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you. Anand, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mridula. That was quite an illustrative talk, and you detailed about the marine mammal population management in the United States. And I think definitely India has a lot to learn from NOAA's marine mammal guidelines, and we need to see that how can we build more collaborations with international partners around the world. We have a few questions for you, Mridula, if you are with us. Somebody is asking, what are the common or good methods for marine mammal especially dolphin surveys. So basically, what are the methods that are in place right now that are used for surveying dolphins?
Okay, thank you for the question. So most of the at-sea observations are through small boat surveys. So you are collecting visual data, and so you take a boat, you search for dolphins, and once you find a suitable pod of dolphins, then you try to collect information on behavior, location data, and you get photo ID information in terms of trying to determine what species it is and what the composition of the pod is, whether there are moms and calves, or whether there is, it's a particular social group, whether it's a nursery group or it's, a mating group. So there's a lot of data you can collect from just surface observations. So you really don't have to go underwater to study dolphins. Luckily for us, they do come to the surface. And so we do collect some surface information, but that's just one half of the story. Other ways we collect information is through biopsy sampling, which is to try to get genetics material. And this is, you get some tissue from the animals through very established techniques, and you have to be really trained to to target these animals, but you can get information, genetic material, which then you can analyze and get more information on population structure, understand social structure. But also you can, these days, with the tissue information, we can even get into stable isotopes, contaminants, hormone analysis. There's just a lot of information you can gather from biopsy sampling. There's also increasingly, we are developing different types of tagging techniques to understand movement patterns. So like I said, with dolphins, because they are inaccessible to us and we only get a glimpse, a snapshot of their lives, we need to know, and usually it's only daytime observations, right? We go out and we're only seeing a part of their lives. So if we want to know what their movement patterns is during the day or weekly or monthly, then there are things like satellite tags or suction cup tags that you have both invasive and non-invasive tags, and so that can give you some idea of the movement patterns of these animals, but also information on diving, how deep they dive, and whether it's a foraging dive or is it just a shallow dive during traveling. So you can determine a lot from the tagging data. And depending on the nature of the tag, you can get more long duration information or short duration information. And these days, we're also investing in acoustics is, again, a really big way where you can use hydrophones or establish acoustic networks, whether it's, temporary recorders in shallow waters or in more deeper waters that last for months, 6 months, or a year, that give you a really good understanding of the distribution of the species on a seasonal basis as well as an annual basis. So acoustics is really good. However, the animal has to vocalize. So if the animal is not vocalizing, then we don't get that information. But there are some species like sperm whales and beaked whales that really are conducive for acoustic monitoring and ultimately even estimating abundance. So that's just I think a subset of some of the approaches we can use. So you can use small or large vessels, but hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah. In continuation of this question, I would like to ask you mentioned about suction cup tagging. So I believe suction cup tagging would give you only a short-term data, or do we have suction cup tags which can sustain for a longer period of time on the animal's body?
We're developing it. The suction cup tags are non-invasive in one sense, but well, nothing is truly non-invasive. We're still chasing these animals and we're, trying to interfere with their normal behavior. But most of these don't last for very long, maybe a few weeks. That's about it. A few days to a few weeks, maybe a month. It depends on the species. But if you want like short-term information, for example, if an animal is making nearshore offshore movements on a daily basis, then the suction cup tags will really give you quite a bit of information. And you can also, one of the projects I was involved in, we were able to attach a video to it as well, a camera. So you can get video information about the behavior, the interactions between the animals. But by and large, you get good diving information, how deep they dive on an average. And if you get the right, a good sampling of animals, then you know how a female may dive, how a male may dive, or a mom with a calf may dive. So you get a lot more information that way. But yeah, suction cup tags are still very not long duration tags.
Thanks, Mridula. We have another question for you. Sohini is asking, how can we build an effective stranding response program in India? Stranding incidences are only being shared from places where researchers are working on marine mammals. So this is not evenly distributed, leading to data gaps. So basically, how do we build a good stranding response program in India, in a place like India where there is lack of data?
That's a great question, and I think that's the question a lot of us, Anand knows, and the Bani and others know that it's it's been a long effort. We have been trying this for maybe a decade, I think. From the first workshop we tried, and I think a group of us, we came and we put together guidelines, and we submitted to multiple agencies and said, hey, here's a national guideline, you can use it and then modify it for the Indian situation, depending on the decision makers. So there is framework, there is a guideline available, and it's really important that you have national coordination. And so it goes back to one of the slides I was talking about, the government, university, NGO partnerships. So government has to invest the resources in supporting these different independent entities. And they establish the guidelines, they provide the resources, the funding, and that way you have a lot more entities getting involved. And also part of it is also training. You need trained responders. Not everybody can just go to a dolphin and get information. It is complicated. You need people with the right level of training to collect that basic information. A lot of the stranded animals in India are going to be dead animals most of the time. And when you're dealing with dead animals, you can collect a lot more data. But it's not just about data collection, it's about how that data is then processed, right? You take the data and then you plug it into a database. And you also, if you're collecting tissue samples or any other type of biological samples, then it has to be processed, analyzed by a reputed lab. And also the carcass has to be necropsied and get additional information on stomach camera. I mean, the amount of information that can be collected from a stranded animal is incredible. But building that network requires that government support at the national level. And then the independent entities, they cannot be everywhere. They don't have those resources to do that. And a lot of them are doing incredibly good work with what they can. And they all understand the risks involved and the data gaps, and they understand the funding needs. But ultimately, it's the government's, I think, responsibility, from my perspective, I think, to help establish that guidance and network.
Yeah, thank you, Mridula. We have one more question for you. Krishna Priya is thanking you for your wonderful lecture, and she's asking whether NOAA is providing training in marine mammal conservation and research activities. Is there any kind of training program that NOAA is organizing for, I think, anyone around the world?
We used to, I think. So it's become tough now with COVID and with a lot of restrictions. It's becoming harder and harder for us, and our funding is drastically getting reduced, unfortunately. But yeah, there are opportunities, not perhaps through NOAA, but we can collaborate with universities and try to establish that training. So there are universities like Duke, but there are other universities now that I know of that are increasingly trying to build that training programs that allow students from India and elsewhere to come and learn data collection, learn the core elements of marine mammal research and science, the theoretical aspects of it. So that's happening. But I think it's harder and harder with as time goes by because it's so expensive. But there are avenues, and it really depends on the person and the particular timing and a lot of factors. So you have to email me and email others to find more.
Yeah, so just to add to that, even us at Wildlife Institute of India, we are planning to organize a workshop for marine mammal stranding response. And we wanted it to happen this year, but then this year is unusual for everybody. So we are most probably we'll be trying to organize it early next year. And I'm just I'm wondering that if Noah would be of any help in that, because if there is any kind of collaboration that we can seek, and then that would lead to international participants to the workshop, and obviously international expertise to the workshop, if that is possible.
Yeah, I think we can certainly talk about that. I mean, Noah has been involved in a few workshops in India, and we've done that, and it's been successful. But yeah, I mean, and there are a lot of Indian organizations and researchers have also run workshops. So I think, yeah, we'd definitely be interested.
Great, great.
Definitely should explore it.
Mridula, if you have some 5 minutes, then we can go for another two questions.
Okay.
We have questions coming from our YouTube watchers as well. There's one question by Chinmaya. She's asking, thanks for a great talk, Dr. Mridula. Does individual behavior of animals affect the data collection and conservation strategies? Like some animals are bold and some animals are shy. So if individual behavior, species level behavior would affect data collection.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. And yes, it does. So I would say a lot of the data we collect from animals have bias. It's biased by the researcher, it's biased by a platform, by a data collection technique. And some species, for example, and I've seen this multiple times, like, if you have bow riding dolphins, and you're taking pictures, you're trying to get pictures of all the animals in the pod. If you have bow riding animals and curious animals, you tend to photograph those animals more frequently than and some of the other members of the pod, because they keep showing up near your boat, and as you're taking pictures, you end up taking pictures of the same one, but you may miss out other individuals in the pod. So it's very important we get training on how to make sure we collect information from all the members of the pod. But it's not always easy. Some species, some animals, even within a pod, will be curious, but some will be diving and skittish, and so you don't get information. Dolphins in general, some of them will approach the boat. Sometimes you have whales that may come that approach, but there are so many animals that are incredibly skittish. You have resource dolphins, and then you have larger animals like gray whales and blue whales and fin whales. All of them have very distinct behaviors, and you have to understand their dive patterns. You have to understand where they might surface, and also the behavior. Sometimes they can, like killer whales, if you're studying them, they can easily you can lose them in absolute calm waters in like 5 minutes. Even though it's such a large animal, you think you cannot lose them, but you can. So it really makes a big difference in how we collect information. The other thing I would say with species specific is so important is there are a lot of cryptic species like beaked whales, which we hardly see. We see them for microseconds, and we really don't know anything about them. And so a lot of information comes from tagging work or acoustics. And so our conservation is actually affected by it, because if you only see animals some of the time, you don't know what the actual population size is. Just because you have a lot of dolphins that show up, you think, oh, they're a very large population, but it's just because you're in a certain area at a certain time and these animals are approaching you that you can be misled. But there are other species that you never see, that you never know what the actual population status is. So it's a great question.
We have another question from Dr. Ravichandra Mondreti. He is asking, how can we design an optimal method to carry out at-sea surveys in a developing country like India, considering the difficulties in obtaining funding as well as lack of sufficient expertise?
That's the question for everyone here. I think we're all trying to answer that question. It's not easy. There are ways. We know there are established ways, whether it's through boards or large, but maybe it's a combination of it. But I think there are enough brilliant minds and talented folks who need to come up with the best response of how we do it. I think the key thing is, from a science perspective, you know the methods, you know how to collect the data, how to analyze the data. So that part is easily shared. The part that is difficult is how do you go and collect that information? Because everybody's resources, infrastructure, abilities are different, capabilities are different. So that is a decision that has to be made by, the government and by different groups involved in it. It's
And
not an easy thing.
don't you
I don't
think
think
it should be
optimum is very
legally?
hard.
I'm sorry, Mridula, I think just to add to it, don't you think it should be based on what are the already known marine mammal population stocks over there? And based on that, we should design our surveys, because it cannot be made one design for all of India, because India has a long coastline. So I think that
Absolutely.
there should be some kind of strategy depending upon which coast, which area are we targeting, based on that.
Yeah, exactly. That's why it goes back to, I think what I said was in the beginning is you have to define your research priorities, your goals, which species you want to target and why, and then you put the necessary resources to it. But so it's ultimately, if you want to protect and recover a species, then you have to make the get the research priorities all organized, because like I said, you just cannot study all animals all the time. It's not possible.
Thank you, Mridula. We have just last one question for you. Sorry. Some anonymous question from somebody is asking, is it possible to extract DNA in highly decomposed marine mammals? So I'm not sure whether highly
I don't know.
decomposed.
I can't answer that. It depends on the condition, and that's why you need veterinarians and sampling people to
I
figure
think
that out.
I can answer this question because we have been working on dugong samples, and a lot of times we get dugong strandings where the animal is highly decomposed, and from that we have successfully extracted DNA. And the techniques lie in trying to store the sample as soon as possible in more. More less than minus 20 degrees Celsius. So as soon as you freeze the sample or preserve it in absolute ethanol or something, it is better because it delays the decomposition process.
Yeah, it really depends on the body condition, and because of tropical climates, the decomposition is very high. So accessing that animal quickly, getting whatever you can, but you won't know the results until the DNA is analyzed, even if you collect a sample. So yeah.
Okay, Mridula, thank you, thanks a lot, and sorry for taking a little extra time from your allotted time slot. And
No, no.
for
Thank
all
you.
for all the attendees, Dr. Mridula will be back again with us tomorrow at 9:30 Indian time, and for the panel discussion. And thank you, Mridula. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anand. Good
Uh,
night.
yeah, good night. Yeah.
For me, it's good night. Good
Yeah,
morning. Have a good day. Bye.
bye bye.